This video contains spoilers for Endwalker. Because of the nature of this video and the amount of sources required, it is recommended to pause if necessary to read them as they're shown. Due to copyright, Encyclopedia Eudia cannot be shown directly on screen and has thus been summarised when discussed in this video. However, please check the description and pinned comments for the sources used. Welcome to another video on the Ancients. The aim here is to examine some of the misconceptions that have become common in the community discussions on the Ancients and see how they hold up to what we know from various game sources. One common argument that comes up in the community, which this video intends to address, is the idea that the Convocation had all-encompassing power. While details on the Convocation's full workings are not known, there is still some lore we can draw on to give us a flavour of how it performed in its function. The excerpt from the upcoming Encyclopedia Eudia 3 in the broader entry on the ancient world states their government was elected in nature and safeguarded the star. Elsewhere in the book, in the entry The Convocation of 14, this is repeated, with the body's purpose being described as improving the star whilst maintaining the balance of nature. The Convocation's authority spanned legislation, judicature, and administrative policy, which the entry details through displaying each seat and its province. It states these individuals were exceptional even within an already extraordinary populace, and that the 14 never abused their positions for their own gain. A few tidbits not revealed in the game itself are the seat of Nabrialis, who was their martial champion and the refiner of technique, and Dudalaphon, whose seat was innovation and the appraisal of architecture. It also mentions Emeraloth's role in a bit more detail, extending to medicinal and therapeutical practices. As noted before, references in the book should be tempered by the understanding that it is written by the Scions, much as with the Codex, so it's not clear how accurate entries on the ancient world can be given that none but the Warrior of Light witnessed this firsthand. Nonetheless, it is an additional source of information and so is being included for completeness. A significant piece of lore pushing against the idea of it as some all-powerful body is the below from Shadowbringers, from the quest The End of a World. We can see from this that the Shade is puzzled at the suggestion that the city has a ruler, instead referring to the Convocation's role as a form of government as a supervisory body. Also from Shadowbringers, and mentioned in the short story Through His Eyes, it is mentioned that there is a scope to raise the matter of suitability for an office in the Hall of Rhetoric, where the ancients debated matters. Whilst emet-selch is uttering an idle threat to his friend in this case, one can take this as a pointer that such matters would be open for debate. Indeed, as noted in the video on the third sacrifice, even the way the Convocation's decision regarding the third sacrifice was communicated was as a decision which appeared to have been debated at the time, spurring the division in their society back in those troubled days. Another segment of lore from Ponder, Warrant, Cherish, Welcome, outlining the limits on the Convocation's power, comes from emet-selch, where he outlines the expectation that the Convocation, along with all high-ranking officials of the ancient world, conduct themselves transparently. Adding to this, in the Quest An Unwelcome Visitor, we see that it is expected that scrutiny applies across all levels of their governing bodies, and this extends to members of the Convocation, such as La Habrea. Indeed, as an additional balancing factor in how the individual members of the Convocation went about their decision-making, conveyed in the quest A Keyword's Jail, they had to take into account the judgment of the seat of Elbus, which was meant to be impartial in nature. The entirety of Pandemonium deals with the concept of duty, La Habrea's, Themis's, and Erichthonius's, and La Habrea acknowledging where his misjudgments led him astray and put him on his current path. As a final piece of evidence, there is also this answer from Yoshida given at the Q&A that took place before 6.1 regarding the function of the Convocation sigils. As we can see, the sigils are intended as a method of holding the Convocation accountable for the great power it wielded. All in all, a picture emerges that the Convocation was staffed by foremost experts in their fields, whose decisions were made in an advisory capacity, rather than exercised as some form of absolute power, with the emissary intended to provide an impartial perspective, sometimes weighing against the rest of his colleagues, with a strong expectation to conduct themselves responsibly and honourably in service of their duty. The Korean Q&A added a bit more detail on this. with those. Tempering is a long-standing plot feature of Final Fantasy XIV that has evolved quite a lot over the years. In this segment we will focus on what it is, what Shadowbringers and Endwalker added to our understanding, and whether it has ever featured as being a main driver in the motivations of the unsundered Ascians and Fandaniel. Briefly, tempering is an alignment to a primal's aether, bringing the summoner in sync with its element, and also featuring a component that renders the soul more umbral in nature. Various factors can affect the degree of it, like the way the summoners perceive the primal, and there is a suggestion when the scions seek to untemper Tiamat that maintaining the retention of memory may run counter to it. It's difficult to pick apart how much of what we know of modern-day primals straightforwardly applies to Hydaelyn or Zodiac. This is especially the case because we know the Ascians altered the rites to summon them in at least one way, to imbue zeal to spread faith in the primal and its summoners. By contrast, with Zodiac, the Loporrits reaffirm what was said by emet-selch, i.e. that it was the sheer power of the primal that drew his summoners in. Zodiac exhibits other features that differentiate him from a regular primal, like lacking an intrinsic will of his own. Instead, he is under the complete control of his heart, as Fandaniel proved when assuming this position. The primal did, however, show a manner of consciousness, representing the assembled souls in him, that resisted Fandaniel's urge to harm the star, asserting themselves as its will and intent to act for its greater good. So it would appear that the collective of souls comprising what loosely amounts to Zodiac's consciousness opposed such destructive urges. With this in mind, with Elbus as his heart and thus controller, it's not apparent that Zodiac would exert any control over his summoners in the typical primal sense. Additionally, the argument has come up in some quarters of the community that the ancients as a whole were tempered, but it should be obvious from the above sources that the summoners were those drawn into the primal's aether. However, this is made clear as well by emet-selch when he discusses the criteria the Ascians use for elevating new shards to their constituent Convocation seats. The below is reproduced from English as well as the French localization for the fact that it is worded even more clearly. So we see that this faith he speaks of distinguishes them from other sundered shards which, as should be recalled, are shards of fragmented ancient souls. This would strongly suggest that the effect was localized to the summoners, which is consistent with the law on primal summoning. Although primals can spread this influence beyond the original summoners, this is usually down to their desire to do so, and not an automatic feature of the original summoning. The extent of this can be controlled according to comments in an interview by the writers, but as there is no sign that Zodiac possessed this desire, this is mostly just being noted for the viewer's information. In some cases, I've seen it argued that the Convocation could not be reasoned with by Venard due to being tempered. However, she knew from the Wall's recollection of events how things would play out, and possessed the ability to shield one from etheric corruption using her Traveller's Ward. Furthermore, the ancients were well versed in aetherology, and it's not difficult to believe that they could find a way to remove tempering if it became an issue, in like manner to how the Scions solved this problem using the Porxies. It is known via turn 9 of the second quirk of Bahamut that a primal can choose to relinquish their hold on a person's mind, freeing them from enthrallment. If Venard anticipated that this would hinder her outreach to the Convocation, this raises the question of why did she not alert them to the risk beforehand? And besides, in addressing the Convocation's motives, as mentioned earlier in the video on the third sacrifice, Venard fully concedes that they too do seek to do what is best in safeguarding their star. Besides it being far from clear that tempering had affected their judgment, her words there are not consistent with how one would view the Convocation if they were mere thralls of the primal. So how does this play out in practice with those Ascians or their shards when we interact with those over the course of Shadowbringers and Endwalker? Well, Fandaniel feels absolutely no compulsion to serve Zodiac, and even acts so as to destroy him. Indeed, he rejects his identity as Hermes, even though Graha does suggest that his soul has an inherent propensity to it when reflecting on the similarities between Ammon and Hermes. Nonetheless, whatever emet-selch comments on the faith engraved on the souls of the original summoners, this did not suffice to bind Fandaniel to any form of servitude to Zodiac. Elbus, after his defeat, reveals his motives for emerging from Zodiac. It was out of a genuine desire to mediate the dispute between his people as the emissary. This is reflected in his comments after his final defeat in Seat of Sacrifice, with the French version noted previously and the EN version as below. If he wished to avail himself of tempering, there would be no need to even leave the primal. In fact, doing so would be counterproductive to such an end. In addition, Eustola surmises that what causes Elidibus to suffer lapse in his memory is his primal nature, rendering him receptive to the prayers of those who put their faith in him. Emet-selch in Ere Our Curtain Falls further attributes this to Elidibus's refusal to draw on his memory crystal. He articulates his reason for not doing this, stating that his duty is sufficient to drive him forward, and that he sees repeated loss of some of his memories over time as an inevitability which he would rather not be plagued with twice. The comments here also reflect on La Habrea and how his drive became a recklessness, which slowly burnt away his identity. This is repeated in the final arc of Pandemonium as well. Emet-selch's insistence on preserving his memory and identity, in line with Graha's hypothesis about the relation between memory and tempering, may also in part explain why he showed no signs of lacking free will. Elidibus and La Habrea deliberately allowed for their identities to fade, but in service of committing themselves fully to their work. Elidibus is a special case in that his primal nature renders him susceptible to hearing those voices praying to him, but with Zodiac and the souls within him dormant, and given that Elidibus had hoped to channel the hopes and prayers of those heroes of other shards, it seems Eustola is addressing this source of power of his in general terms rather than anything else. In speaking on Elidibus, in an interview with RPG Site on the 7th of October in 2020, Yoshi had the following to say. We see here that Yoshida does not allude to tempering, but as a character they tried to make understood through projection of a character supportive to the wall on him. Eagle-eyed observers will recall in the lead-up to the final battle in the Seat of Sacrifice that the wall, in trying to comprehend Elidibus, questions Graha and where he drew his conviction from. Equally, Yoshida refers to Elidibus's distinct concept of justice. With Emet-selch, his motives are explored quite directly in the game, namely a yearning to restore his people. Even after his defeat in Ultima Thule, he does not regret the decisions he took, stating that his principles are inviolate and invincible. This, once more, is after he even acted so as to assist the wall in his battle with Elidibus, an action which could only undermine the Ascians' plan, and which sits uncomfortably with tempering being the prime driver behind Emet-selch's actions. In interview commentary, Yoshi P explored Emmet's motives in a lengthy interview with Ankh Morning on the 23rd of September 2021. It is beyond the scope of this video to probe the full interview here, but in relaying Emmet's motives, Yoshi underlines that Emmet truly did intend to seek out a different method to those he had been pursuing, which once more ill fits with tempering. Ishikawa, reflecting on Emmet in a separate interview with VG247, had this to say about Emet-selch. Here, she reflects on how the kindness we see in Emet-selch, beneath his hard exterior, is something that would eventually lead later to his downfall, likely referring to the same earnest intention Yoshi P refers to in his interview comments, and how it is life in the sundered world which changed him. It's worth noting Yoshi's reflections on Emmet from an interview with the Daily Star. Here, he relays the authenticity characterizing Emet-selch's beliefs, and the ability of the ancients to brook disagreements with those whose views diverge from theirs. Lastly, in an interview with Silicon Era, 8th of April 2020, Yoshi reflects on the role Emmet served in the narrative. We see that, to have the players understand the Ascians, he is intended to be a character who tries to understand the protagonist and the masses, presumably the sundered. In closing, Emet-selch's statement in Shadowbringers, alluding to the tempering of the Convocation, has generated a lot of confusion, and it's not entirely clear that the writers had a fully fledged out understanding of what this entailed from beginning to end. On a thematic level, the goal of Shadowbringers was to help the player understand the Ascian perspective, and this was done through introducing us to the deeper motives of the Convocation, and especially Emet-selch and Elidibus. Endwalker expands on this by showing us the kind of people Elidibus, as Themis, and La Habrea were. We understand that this was out of love for their people, but also out of the very strong sense of duty they possessed as members of the Convocation. A sense of duty which Pandemonium expands further on and explains the development of in both La Habrea and Themis. The story's major theme is the ways in which the Unsundered changed, and those in which they didn't, due to the destruction of their civilization and the bloody restoration they worked towards out of a sense of duty towards it, as well as the sacrifice and love the ancients bore for their star as they toiled to save it, and how devotion to this cause led to the gradual erosion of La Habre's identity and fragments of Elidibus's memory. With emet-selch, there is an emphasis on his efforts to understand the Sundered and find a different way forward to the rejoinings. With Fandaniel, we see no sense of loyalty and even a bid to destroy the very god the Ascians are said to serve, Zodiarch. Finally, it should be noted that even if, as some like to argue, Zodiarch summoning had changed the ancients' culture at that point in time, this still did not justify their genocide. Even though Endwalker tried to paint the picture of them sacrificing until nothing was left, Elidibus's intercession to mediate over the conflict in their society demonstrated that it would be controversial to use Zodiarch willy-nilly, and absent the strong motivation in freeing their brethren from inside him, it's not plausible that they'd lean on him for every little thing, especially with them still possessing their creation magics. And besides, it's even more laughable a proposition after the 12, the totally not primals installed by Vanar to ensure stability in the Sundered world, will fade out of existence, and yet even so, Kryal and Graha resolved to preserve the noble lie to avoid sapping the sense of comfort of the supposedly oh-so-scrappy Sundered. A reticence to expose a now empty and void faith that was nowhere to be found in Heavensward, with the 12 replaced by some prayer voicemail machine to be installed in the ethereal sea. Forge ahead indeed. Similarly, Encyclopedia Eudia Volume 3 notes in the section This Journey's End that the Scions provided precious few details about their encounter with Meteon, presumably to risk the potential of destructive use being made of dynamis. It seems more and more the Scions are content to cover things up. In summary, to reduce such motives to the shadow god made them do it would undercut much of this more nuanced motivation, and besides is not consistent with multiple story elements as well as out-of-game commentary by the developers. So while this will forever remain in the eye of the beholder, it is my belief that tempering is mostly just a red herring in explaining the actions of the unsundered Ascians, and was likely invoked to explain away some of the zeal Ascians like Nabrialis exhibited. There is much debate over whether the Sundering could be considered a genocide. The aim here isn't to fully retread these debates, so much as to clarify some misconceptions around what it did do. We know for certain that the Sundered have much shorter lifespans, lost most of their echo powers, although these can be rehabilitated to some degree when exposed to a star shower or similar event, as it awakens the trauma seared into their very souls by the original final days, lost their creation magics and are much physically smaller than the ancients, as well as having etherically weaker souls and bodies. These are the facts, and ones which Vanar would have observed from interacting with the Warrior of Light and possibly also gleaned from their testimony. As a recap on death in the setting, unlike the real world, this does not begin and end with physical death. That is only the beginning of the story, as the soul will be pulled into the underworld, now known as the Ethereal Sea, and potentially linger for some time, before eventually having most of its memories washed away and emerging as a new person in time. There are ways of preventing even a disembodied soul from succumbing to this process, much as the Ascians and Xenos did through the Echo, or Y'shtola did with Flow. But it is this whole sequence of events taken together which is ultimately the death of a being. We see Alphenau using the term genocide when disputing Emperor Varys' intentions towards the Beast Tribes in the quest A Difference of Opinion. It arises again when used by Ericthonius in opposition to his mother's plans in the French localization. Translated, it says, given how he frames it there, one could be forgiven for thinking he's addressing Vanar. It is asserted by some, somewhat bizarrely, that because the Sundering did not immediately kill the ancients, it does not count as an act of murder or, more broadly, a genocide. The absurdity here becomes more apparent when we consider that the event cut their lifespan short, by whatever means, and is not really much different to some form of poison cutting a being's life short. The use of poison to kill someone is a clear-cut act of murder. Only in this case, the Sundering both does this and introduces so many deficiencies to the victim that through the evolutionary process, new species will emerge, reproducing the below from the previous video. The writers have also referred to the Sundering in direct terms as an event that resulted in the killing of a being, although for reasons we can only guess at, this is not as apparent in the English localization, so we will have to make some recourse once more to the original Japanese version to see this. The French localization states much the same. Another example is from this excerpt of the 6.0 Q&A. We shall return to this answer again later. As such, while it follows from the fact that it reduced their lifespans alone that the sundering would have resulted in the death of those ancients sundered, the above should further reinforce this understanding. Reliance is also often placed in emet-selch's words in the ocular in the quest Return to Ulmor, where he states, "This is used to claim that the sundering did not affect the bodies of the sundered." While the English localization is somewhat awkwardly worded here, the fact that it goes on to say that it strikes at everything defining the target should expose this inference is hopelessly flawed. Indeed, a little later, emet-selch even goes on to say that the sundering would create. This is when he is illustrating its effect on Rhine for demonstration's sake. The fact that it mentions strength here should make it obvious that this is also affecting corporeal attributes. Nonetheless, reviewing the original Japanese segment of this dialogue once more shows that the intended meaning here is not to suggest that the sundering isn't affecting the flesh, but rather that it is not only affecting it. The meaning is more faithfully preserved in the French localization. In addition to Yoshi's answer about how the sundered races evolved, it is worth partly reproducing the below from the Korean Q&A. This should make it clear why the English localization's wording choice alone can't really sustain the view that it did not affect their flesh. In any case, whatever the mechanism by which the sundering shortened the ancients' lifespans, it remains the fact that it did this to them, and this alone would have sufficed to end their lives prematurely. As discussed at the beginning, however, death in Final Fantasy XIV's world isn't mere physical death, and instead is the death of the individual, through the loss of all that defined them as a person, and most importantly, their memories. The sundering also stripped the ancients who were subjected to it of these. While future reincarnations of the individual will retain some fragments of memories, it should be noted that this could be said of any person killed in the game, given that the locus of memories is the soul, which persists even through each reincarnation, and so some memories will be preserved in its aether. It does not change that the person's passing would be considered a death in the usual sense, and that that person would be seen as no more once they've gone through this process. The same applies for being tempered or etherically corrupted, for example as a void scent or a sin eater, to the point where this is beyond curing. The individual who that was is considered gone. Further, as a reminder of what was said in the previous video, in the entry Vanar's Choice, we are told that Vanar's collaborators were aware of her desire to sunder mankind from the outset. It states she convinced her followers that it was necessary to go through with the sundering, and that the intention was that all life upon it would be diminished in power, including mankind, whose lifespans would be shortened and limited and their ability to use creation magics curtailed. This, they believed, would improve man's ability to use dynamis and turn the sundered, who would inherit the world, into emet-selches, to one day stand against Ensinger. Emet-selch recalls how the sundering wiped the memory of what the sundered were in the following below tragic excerpt, commenting on the cave paintings in the Quintana Ravel. He expresses similar horror at the state of the sundered in his Convocation crystal, and this is illustrated more graphically in a panel of the near crossover event Vestiges of Paradise, which was authored by Ishikawa. As can be seen, it is only after some time passes that the sundered begin to grow capable of forming cultures again and learning language. As the Ascians possess the echo, which La Habre uses no less to commune with the Warrior of Light when he first meets them, it can be argued that the damage inflicted on the sundered was initially so severe that it inhibited their ability to form thoughts intelligible through the echo. Even when emet-selch first meets the Warrior of Light in Endwalker, when Elbus sends them back through time, he is able to communicate with them after he reinforces their aether, likely as a result of the echo. Likewise, it is the echo that allows the Warrior of Light to communicate with the unusually intelligent little troll in Labyrinthos quests, owing to its superior intellect compared to its brethren, enabling mutual understanding through this method. As can be seen, even though the Warrior of Light was not expecting to be able to understand the troll, mere possession of the echo enabled them to comprehend it, as it possessed a sufficient level of intelligence for this. The fact that the unsundered Ascians could not even initially communicate with their sundered brethren speaks to the devastation this inflicted on them. Bearing in mind that the ancients had lost their natural powers, and that many of their structures were built around the manipulation of creation magics, it can be imagined how confused and helpless they would be in their newfound state, and thus do Yoshi's words on why the sundered races evolved in response to these new conditions begin to make sense. It is likely they would have reduced to a very primitive existence at that time. Alizé in Shadowbringers also related her suspicions on why the star shower didn't suffice to awaken in her the echo. We see from this that the memories are latent to some degree within her, but when she tries to focus on these, they vanish, and attributes this to the nature of her broken soul. Similarly, with Amon, he remarks that it is only due to the ironic fact that Cairo seared memories of Elpis deeper into his soul that he recalled them, even without the aid of the medium of Convocation crystals. It should be further noted that the passage of the ancient world into oblivion was the intended result of Hydaelyn and her summoners, as stated by Elidibus in Shadowbringers. This is also repeated by the Watcher in Endwalker. One other argument that has cropped up is that because La Habrea's act of surgically cutting away part of his soul did not inflict memory loss on him, ergo the Sundering would not intrinsically do so. This is a flawed argument for several reasons. Firstly, although Vannat intended the Sundering to deprive mankind of what she saw as a temptation, and to enable it to wield dynamis more easily, her method for inflicting it was imprecise and was also a desperate action when faced with Zodiac, in her own words. The French version frames this as Zodiac's power being so great that she had to drag the entire star into this. Supporting this, Yoshi in the 6.0 Q&A remarks on the desperate nature of the action and how she could not fine-tune how it would strike. To recap the relevant sections from Pandemonium, the action La Habrea performed was: this was because he and Athena had pursued a project together to overcome the inability of the ancients to create souls and to be able to merge with their creations, the so-called hemitheoi. We then find out that Athena, who we later find out was corrupted by the alien stone, the Heart of Sebek, such that her inhibitions lapsed, sought to infect La Habrea with the same desire in her after they had soul bonded. And it is here we see Themis point out the risks of his course of action, even one as deliberate and surgical as La Habrea's was. We see that even this dissection and removal of the memories in question risked ending his life. In comparison, the Sundering was an action performed with so much power it split the entire world and all souls upon it. The sheer scale and difference in degree of control here alone should account for why the Sundering isn't directly comparable to what La Habrea did, even with all the risks it entailed. All in all, there is very little to go off from La Habrea's example to say that the Sundering, an act different in its specific nature, splitting the ancient's entire existence into 14 fragments, and with far more power poured into it, as well as a much broader scope, can be compared or said not to affect the memory of those struck by it, in addition to La Habrea's smaller scale, more surgical action already being described as very risky to his life. Encyclopedia Eudia Volume 3 also includes some comments which push against the popular interpretation following Endwalker that Hermes invented Zodiac, in spite of the core texts never suggesting as much. The entry "The Summoning of Zodiac" attributes calculations about the amount of power, and consequently sacrifice, which the primal would require to La Habrea. As the Convocation was unaware of the true cause, their research was motivated by the weakening of the celestial currents, with the star appearing to decay and the rot spreading from areas where these currents were weak. The entry again reiterates that the scale of such sacrifice is not something modern, i.e. sundered society, would condone, consistent with the challenge emet-selch poses to Alphenau at the end of Shadowbringers. It further reiterates the voluntary nature of the sacrifice, with no ancients evading their duty when the call to sacrifice was made. It remarks on Elidibus, standing among those chosen, as being insistent on fulfilling this duty and his soul taking its place as the central link and nexus among the rest. Finally, the entry once more reiterates that Asm took their leave over this dispute, after Elidibus had judged in favour of the remaining 12 Convocation seats' decision to proceed with this act, an act which had become their last resort, as noted in prior sources. Zodiac's origins are further reinforced by the fact an entry covering Quetzalcoatl, the primal-like guardian entity created and summoned in the words of La Habrea, where it is said that this allowed the ancients to form the basis of primal summoning that had been used to summon the great primal. Indeed, the origins of this research and what motivated the Convocation to engage in it are also detailed in the entry on the ancient version of the Final Days, which notes that the ancients were swift to mount a fight, drawing on arcane arts other than creation magics when these became destabilized, albeit even this did not suffice in the face of the despair and horror Endsinger was showering the star with. For its part, the entry on Academia Anida mentioned that while surprised by the news, many Emeraldians did not immediately realise the threat it did pose, and with an optimistic mood instead saw this as a substantive puzzle to solve using their talents. By contrast, the authorities in this area of creation magics, and in particular the words of La Habrea, saw this with wary concern and had begun investigating the matter. Their research included an in-depth study on Archaeotania, a beast described as more dangerous than any phantom creation. This motivated the basis of what would become modern primal summoning as an indirect means of tackling the crisis. This should also push further against the popular headcanon that the Convocation delayed in reacting to the crisis, or did not take it seriously. These entries suggest the exact opposite.